Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello, listeners. In this episode, we speak to Liz Monson about the concept of crazy wisdom, its Tibetan roots, as well as its applications and misapplications in the West. Liz introduces us to Drukpa Kunley, a 15th-century Tibetan yogi who embodies these principles and who is the subject of her new book, Tales of a Mad Yogi.
Liz Monson is the spiritual co-director of Natural Dharma Fellowship and the managing teacher at Wonderwell Mountain Refuge. She has been studying, practicing, and teaching Tibetan Buddhism in the Kagyu and Nyingma lineages for over 30 years. Liz holds a PhD in religion from Harvard University and an MFA in writing and poetry from Naropa University. Liz is the author of Tales of a Mad Yogi, the life and wild wisdom of Drukpa Kunley.
We'd love to keep in touch, so head on over to noblemindpodcast.com where you can join our email list, send us a message, and tell us how we're doing. And as always, get this episode's show notes. Enjoy the show.
Here we are with Liz Monson. Welcome to Noble Mind.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with both of you.
Welcome, Liz.
Why don't we get started? Maybe just have you introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. Well, my name is Liz Monson. These days, I am working as the spiritual co-director of a Buddhist organization called Natural Dharma Fellowship. And I co-direct the organization with Lama Miller. She founded it and invited me to join her. I think it was about 7 years ago we started doing this. I have been studying and practicing Tibetan Buddhism for, it's like 33
Forever.
Years at this point. Forever, it feels like, yes. And for years, I worked as the personal editor for my teacher, traveled with him and stayed in retreat with him. But there was a kind of shift in things that happened at a certain point, and I ended up leaving that community and wanting to continue to study Buddhism in whatever way I could. So I ended up in graduate school doing a more academic-focused study of the Buddhist path and of Buddhism in a larger context altogether in religious studies. And that's where I met up with Willa, and we really felt like we'd found each other again in this lifetime and decided that probably the best work we could do in the world was not so much in academia, but was in stewarding this vessel. This Natural Dharma Fellowship is the name of our organization. And so stewarding this Dharma vessel into the 21st century and seeing what we could do to bring the Dharma into the world. So these days I'm mostly writing and teaching, and a little bit of traveling for teaching, and I'm working with students. That's pretty much what I do. I feel extremely fortunate to have this kind of a lifestyle. So
sounds wonderful. And part of your Buddhist journey has involved becoming an expert on Drukpa Kunley, living in Bhutan.
yes.
What inspired you to write Tales of a Mad Yogi? What's the story around it?
So Tales of a Mad Yogi is kind of the child of years of work. Part of the main focus of my dissertation was this Buddhist saint, Drukpa Kunley, born in 1455. He died in 1529. He was born in south central Tibet in a monastic complex there called Druk Ralung, which was the center location for the Drukpa Kagyu, the middle branch of the Drukpa Kagyu school. But Drukpa Kunley actually spent quite a bit of his life in Bhutan. And these days, he really is known as one of the patron saints of Bhutan. There are two, Drukpa Kunley and Pemalingpa being the other one. And for me, Drukpa Kunley really came to me through Willa, actually, through Lama Willa. We were in a Tibetan class at Harvard, and we were doing readings from different narrative texts. I've always loved narrative literature in Tibetan Buddhism. You know, particularly the story and the mythical literature around Gesar, who is the kind of quintessential Tibetan Buddhist warrior king. But I was looking for a dissertation topic, and as we were reading different selections in this class, Willa became quite enamored of Drukpa Kunley's autobiography, and she started actually beginning to do some translation work on it. But later on in the class, another text was introduced to us that she suddenly really realized was the thing for her, and she was thrilled. And in the course of us having a conversation, I just was having a very hard time landing on a topic. And she said, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you take this autobiography and why don't you work on this? It's really unusual. It's very different. He's a completely different kind of saint in the world. And, I thought, I wasn't so keen necessarily on working on a male saint. I was really more intrigued by some other kinds of ideas, but I thought I started reading it, and I learned very quickly that I could not read it without help. It's a very difficult text. And even those who have translated it in the past talk about how difficult it is. But what really cinched it for me was I discovered through an auspicious connection with my sister who lives in Nepal that my husband and I could go and live in Bhutan for a couple of years, and I could do my research there. And when that possibility opened up, it really made this project feel doable, because to have stayed here in the West, in the United States, and tried to translate this thing on my own, I couldn't imagine how I could do it. And then arriving over there and discovering that Drukpa Kunley was still so alive in the minds and hearts of the people there. And then also I made a very wonderful connection with a Bhutanese scholar translator who got excited about the project and was willing to work with me to help me translate. So together we did a full translation of what's known as the autobiography of Drukpa Kunley. We translated it from Tibetan into English, and we published it in Bhutan. It's called More Than a Madman, which is a kind of a riff off of the other primary book of stories about Drukpa Kunley that is available in the Western world, called The Divine Madman, which is a collection of folk tales about Drukpa Kunley that was put together by Keith Dowman. That book showcases Drukpa Kunley in a very specific way, and it really has become kind of like the main source that most people go to say, oh, this is who Drukpa Kunley is. And I wanted to say, no, that is not all he is. Because when you read his autobiography, you discover somebody very different, a very different kind of crazy wild yogi. And I wanted to really explore what that was, and to help people just see the multidimensionality of this figure, that he's not just a crazy antinomian, let's burn down every social mores, every moral and ethical, law out there just to make a statement. He's so much more than that. He really has a very unique and powerful approach to what it would mean to be an awakened person in the world. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then Tales of a Mad Yogi happened because, Shambhala Publications invited me to write a book about Drukpa Kunley, a biography of him, that was going to be part of a series that they were producing called Lives of the Masters. It should be Lives of the Masters and Mistresses. It is actually, but it should be said that. Anyway, when I started thinking about what they asked, because it had a very specific format, each book was supposed to have a biography, a list of works, and description, very in-depth description of works, and then legacy. And I just felt that the material that I had could not support that kind of a structure. And so I asked them if they would allow me to take a more creative approach to this autobiography, because the autobiography has no narrative continuity, no narrative arc. It's a collection of all kinds of disparate forms of literature through which Drukpa Kunley was exploring his own path and his teachings and his progress. But you can't really tell where he is or when he is, or, So I proposed that based on the hints that I had found, and then also on all the ethnographic work that I did in Bhutan, that I might be able to actually create a narrative arc that could then be populated with these different evocations of Drukpa Kunley's own voice, his own teachings. And happily, Shambhala was quite keen on that. And so the Tales of a Mad Yogi arose out of that arrangement.
I'm wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about Drukpa Kunley. Help us get to know him a little bit more, maybe share a story or two that might bring him to life. And then maybe from there, we'll move into talking about what he has to show and teach us in particular.
Sure, yeah. Well, let's see. So, as I said, he was born in 1455 in the middle of the 15th century. It was a very difficult period of time politically in central Tibet in particular, a lot of infighting between different principalities with, various groups trying to gain power, to stay in power. And Drukpa Kunley, really, his family life was severely affected by those circumstances. His father was murdered when he was about 12, 13 years old by one of his uncles who wanted his father's lands and wealth. And that event really, I think it probably is the key situation that put Drukpa Kunley onto the path of the wandering mendicant, which was very much a popular model at that time. There were other figures in the religious landscape who were known for wandering through the countryside, performing various kinds of outrageous and antinomian activities as a way to try to wake people up and kind of shock them out of conventional ways of thinking and being and just that morass of the conceptual mind that leads to so much suffering. And so Drukpa Kunley really felt that his calling was to follow that path of the wandering yogi. And he left everything behind and wandered off into the Tibetan landscape, traveling from one sacred place to another, visiting one teacher after another, receiving teachings, practicing. And, there are wonderful stories that go with his journey into these different parts of Tibet and eventually into Bhutan, because he seems to have had a very strong connection to Bhutan. He loved the landscape. He loved the fertility and the vibrancy and the textures of that landscape that was so different from the Tibetan plateau. And there are some great stories that are really burned, I would say, into the Bhutanese imaginaire, that everybody knows. So one example is a story of Drukpa Kunley returning actually to his home monastery in Ralong in south central Tibet to visit his cousin, who was the abbot of the monastery there. And on the way, Drukpa Kunley encountered a Tanka painter and his entourage who were also traveling to visit his cousin and to bring some beautiful tankas that this master had painted for Nawang Chogyal, who was that's the abbot. And Drukpa Kunley asked to see these tankas, these beautiful paintings. And so the Tanka painter, somewhat reluctantly, it seems, was finally willing to show him a couple of the different tankas, one of which was this gorgeous tanka of the Drukpa Kagyu lineage. So it was the big lineage tree painting with the tree in the middle of the lake, gorgeous colors and
expensive.
And Drukpa, very expensive, probably took years to, paint. And Drukpa Kunley basically said, well, this is beautiful, but you're missing something here. It's not complete. And the Tanka painter said, what are you talking about? Of course it's complete. No. Here, let me have it. And he put it on the ground, which was, of course, in and of itself sacrilegious. And then put this sacred imagery on the ground. And then standing over it, he urinated all over the Tanka, which of course horrified the Tanka painter and his attendants. And they basically tried to beat Drukpa Kunley off and push him away and were just like disgusted. Who is this beggar that, has ruined this fabulous present for Nawang Chogyal? And they rolled it up and they took it away and they went off back to Nawang Chogyal, where they explained what had happened. And they said, we had this fabulous present for you, but it's ruined. We can't give it to you. And Nawang Chogyal, who had a little bit of a suspicion that perhaps this beggar was not who he claimed he was, said, well, show me the tanka after all. Anyway, and when they unrolled it, it turned out that everywhere where the urine had fallen had turned to brilliant gold. So that when you sometimes see these gorgeous tankas that are limned in gold paint, this is exactly what had happened with the tanka. So that it had made it even more valuable, even more beautiful than it could possibly have been without the urine staining it. And it is said that tanka still is, it abides within the heart center of a Buddha, a big Buddha statue that is in Tango Monastery. And people come on a regular basis to pay homage to this sacred taka.
Is that part of the folk tales or is it part of his autobiography? Am I correct in thinking that these are two very different sets of stories? One is more scholarly and the other one is more racy.
Yes, there is definitely a strong distinction between them. That the actual autobiography that we think that he wrote himself, again, it's very difficult to really attribute what we've got to a true historical figure, because we have no proof that this historical figure actually ever existed, other than the name. That autobiography and what it contains is crazy, but in a very certain kind of way, whereas the folk tales that made up the Divine Madman, the book that Keith Dowman translated, are much more outrageously antinomian. And, Drukpa Kunley is constantly getting drunk and he's sleeping with every woman he comes across, including his own mother. He's pretty much any social mores that you can think of, he's shattering them left and right and center. So there's a big difference between, but the Tanka story actually is in both. It's actually in both, which is kind of funny. Although in the autobiography, it's not told in the first person. It is told as if a disciple was describing the story.
So you've used this word antinomian a few times. I wonder if you can help us understand what that means.
Yeah, so antinomian, it's basically a fancy word for something that is totally outside the boundaries of what we think of as normal behavior and socially acceptable behavior. So something that's antinomian is rupturing the agreed upon value system that we all agree. A stop sign says stop and you stop at that stop sign. Well, an antinomian behavior would be somebody who would say, that doesn't mean that. It means it doesn't mean I have to stop. I'm just going to do something else here, something else that I want to do. So there's a kind of outrageousness and willingness to completely step outside any conceptual box, any way that we tend to reify our reality and to try to control our experience. The antinomian, or the Nyingma, as the Tibetan tradition calls them, the saintly madmen and mad women, not just men, are known for completely operating outside of the box, the conceptual box that most of us structure reality through.
It seems the antinomianism and the idea of so-called crazy wisdom have to do with following one's internal authority rather than strictly following external moral rules.
The only thing I would say to that, the caveat I would make there, is that yes, and at the same time, it's more that the crazy yogi or yogini has had a level of insight into the truth of things as they actually are that is so far beyond where most of us believe and want to believe reality exists and as it is, that the rules that we're playing by don't make sense anymore, because they're actually a vision of reality that is crazy. So while we're calling these saints and, these yogis and yoginis crazy yogis and yoginis, in fact, from their perspective, it's the unenlightened person who is crazy, who is lost in a world of insanity, because they're only seeing their thoughts about reality. They're not seeing things as they actually are. And that having that insight into things as they actually are blows apart the conceptual mind's structuring of reality and structuring of the self to such a degree that the person becomes freed in a way that is purely spontaneous, joyful, exuberant, and really has not any respect or very little respect for, all the rules that everybody is kind of trying to stick to and follow. And I don't just mean like you stop at the stop sign kind of rule. I mean the basic assumptions about what is reality and what are human beings and who am I. Those are what get exploded in that level of insight. And so then action can become quite surprising and spontaneous and compassionately responsive from the perspective that whatever then emerges from that yogi or yogini is an expression of appropriate, compassionate responsiveness. Because that is the nature of who we are as human beings, is that left alone, our fundamental energy would manifest in a compassionate and beneficial way if we stop trying to control things all the time. But it might look very unusual. And it might look very like outside the box.
I remember reading something by the Dalai Lama where he says such a person's worldview is so radically different from from regular worldview. And perhaps in connection with that, we could talk about how concepts can imprison us. You mentioned that at some point. Concept of self and creating a narrative of one's life.
Exactly. And in a way, the Tales of a Mad Yogi is playing with that inherent process that we are all engaged of what we call in Natural Dharma Fellowship, we call it selfing. This endless project of telling the story of me, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, I, me, mine. We're constantly involved in that project. And yet we're always aware that story is dissolving even as we're telling it. So there's almost like a panic about it. Like, I got to get the story of me and I got to hold it and I got to, make sure I fix that. That's a trap. I mean, from the point of view of true liberation, to be caught in that, well, it's as actually one of my advisors in graduate school used to say, it's trying to live in a way that is impossible. Because if you're trying to live a life that is structured by the conceptual mind, you're not in harmony with things as they actually are. And so, from the point of view of somebody like Drukpa Kunley, what the whole point of the Buddhist path is to realign or reharmonize oneself with the way things actually are. Not how we think they should be, not how we wish they would be, not what we are afraid they will be, but how actually is it possible to have a direct perception of oneself, the self, and the phenomenal world, things as they actually are in all of their fullness, which totally overflows the capacity of the thinking mind to encompass, right? The more that we can't be boxed in by concepts. That's how we tend to live, is boxed in by these concepts. So Drukpa Kunley has just blown that apart. And then the Nyingma phenomena is a way of blowing that apart and saying, there's so much more here, everybody. So how can we start to live from that perspective?
Yeah, I have a thought. So I need to find it again. So I'm still stuck on the urination and
yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering, well, first maybe around this idea of being, quote, crazy or seen as insane or a mad person, like that's, our vocabulary is problematic, I think. I think the idea there is that, and please tell me if I'm missing a piece of it, but that to the outside, seeing that behavior, you would be inclined to maybe judge this person as having problems or doing bad things. So, we would be inclined to say this person has issues, right? Or they're acting something out or whatever. And so we impose this kind of mental health language on that of being crazy or mentally ill or something like that. But that would be the sort of outside view kind of judging that. But then on the inside, what you're describing is that behavior is coming from a place of realization on Drukpa Kunley's side, right? That he's sort of gone beyond our sort of rules about what's acceptable or not. Am I onto this here?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think maybe this is the stickiest point of all of this whole phenomena of crazy wisdom, which has been so misunderstood and has been actually co-opted in many ways in the West and used as an excuse for bad behavior that causes harm. And that's a real problem. And I think that, Kate, you really hit it on the head. There's just a lot of misunderstanding as to what's really being meant here. That the idea of crazy wisdom isn't just permission to act like a maniac and do whatever one feels like doing just because one feels like doing it. It's actually meant to signify a level of insight into the nature of things and into the nature of one's own heart mind that is so profound that it fundamentally changes how that person can be in relationship with the world and with oneself. Because one's no longer in a mistaken or an erroneous relationship with the truth of how things actually are, but is come into harmony with that. And then as a result, the actions that arise from that state might appear harmful. But this is of course in the ideal sense, right? They might appear harmful. But if the long-term effect is ultimately a benefit for that person, so that they wake up or they have some deeper recognition of the truth, then such behavior is seen to be appropriate to establishing that other being in a state of wakefulness. If we're really talking about how this could manifest in this day and age, we have a very keen sense these days of harm and the various ways that harm manifests. And we are all becoming more and more aware of long-term patterns of harm that have been embedded in our society, in our political system, in our culture. These things are starting to come more and more to light. And I do think that, we have to be very careful with these conversations around crazy wisdom, not to see them as license to just kind of, act like a total jerk and cause all kinds of pain and harm and difficulty to people just because one is showing off one's insight. I mean, that no true crazy wisdom master would be enacting harm on a deliberate way. Like that would just be completely beyond the tenets of the Buddhist path altogether. Ahimsa, no harm. But it also requires that a level of insight that can see if one's actions are going to be appropriate, to lead to benefit, or if they're going to lead to further harm. And that's where I think the discrimination is so essential.
Would you say that your more accurate understanding of crazy wisdom is illustrated in both texts, as it were, in both the autobiography and the folk tales?
Well, I think so. I do think so. I think they're very different. And yet I think that there is a thread of continuity. And when I did a lot of my doctoral work, I was trying to trace those threads of continuity from the folk tales, which are really overtly outrageous. It's hard for anyone to wrap their mind around. But the madness that is displayed in his own writings is much more of interestingly, the approach is about, I call it a madness of truth-telling and of overcoming hypocrisy, that there is such a commitment that emerges from the words of this narrator, this speaker in the autobiography, such a commitment to exposing the different forms of religious hypocrisy that populate the religious landscape of Tibet and Bhutan at that time, as well, though, as to turn that same penetrating critical gaze on himself. Like he's not just criticizing and pointing a finger out there, but every single time there's a turning back and looking into the different subtle levels of hypocrisy that he sees within his own self and exposing those, sharing those, telling about those. So that there's a kind of madness almost or craziness in this intense focus on revealing the truth of how things actually are, instead of being caught in the fantasies around what is practice, what is Buddhism, how do you progress on the path, what is realization. And he sees so much of what gets claimed, and then the activities are totally different from what is being claimed. And he just can't tolerate that level of hypocrisy.
I was reminded a bit of like Molière, maybe like stuff like Tartuffe.
Right.
And some so-called rude British humor.
Yes.
So it's really, maybe in today's forms, like Charlie Hebdo kind of humor, where it sort of seems offensive, but there's a really profound point being made beyond just drunken vulgarity.
Oh, absolutely. I really don't feel that his actions, whether it's in the folktales or in the autobiography, are simply being done for the sensationalist dimension, right? It's, to make some kind of radical statement. I think that there is a deliberate awareness of what could be exploded by certain activities in terms of the minds of those who are observing or he's engaging with, that it feels very much when you read the literature that there's an intentionality involved in those actions. And in that case, I sometimes think too of like the actions of the coyote trickster, in Native American folktales and myths. The Drukpa Kunley in a certain way, and the Nyingma in general are they're filling that niche in a certain sense. The radical jokester, the crazy figure that's going to just explode whenever things get complacent, whenever things get habitual, then you're going to have these figures that come along and kind of just blast open those spaces for something new to come in, for something different to arise.
I think also encountering these types of stories, for me at least, really exposes my own sensibilities and my own kind of modern Western, like sort of worldview that, I go through most of my days not really thinking about, I'm thinking from it, like it's the lens through which I see the world. But then encountering these stories and having this conversation with you is like, oh, wait, that's just a lens, right? That's just like a view that I'm kind of seeing the world through. And this is an entirely different culture, an entirely different historical period, an entirely different religious worldview. Like all of the whole thing is just so completely different that my mind is kind of like grappling with, how do I look at this? Because it's so different from, again, like how I think about things on a given day, about my ordinary life in the current social and historical context. Which is illuminating and kind of like fun, but also I can imagine it's a little bit sort of disorienting and a little scary too. Like, what do I do with this?
Well, and that's a question I have for you guys, like I really wonder what's your experience like of reading some of these stories of him? I mean, is it like this feeling of just disbelief or, or what do I do with this? Or what's your experience like of encountering the saint?
Of course, it does remind me of magic realism.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, perhaps our listeners have watched the Labyrinth. Was it Pan's Labyrinth?
Pan's Labyrinth, yeah,
by Guillermo del Toro. And like in that story, so there's the conventional reality that the girl is living in, which is post, fascist Spain,
right?
And then there's her fantasy world, but they sort of intersect, which is real and is one a commentary? Is like some people have written about the tyranny of reality.
Right. Is her imaginal world, you just have to wonder, like, the power of the imagination, particularly in Buddhism, actually, and in Tibetan Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, is such a key dimension of the liberative path. Like, without the power of the imagination to bring into view the textures and the colors and the forms of the enlightened state, it's difficult to imagine ourselves into that position. But because of these tools of imagination, and I think of the little girl in that movie, right? She's able to imagine a world that allows her to work out the difficulty, the emotional pain that she's in, and the struggle with the father, and the whole thing is given an imaginative arena within which to be processed and understood and worked out, and then she emerges on the other side of that reconfigured. She's a new kind of person in the world. And I think that these stories of Drukpa Kunley are very much that same kind of process, where the reader is able to enter into this imaginal world where these kind of wild things are happening, ideally to emerge on the other side of that with a different view, a different sense of things, a different way of being present. And I think that's part of how Drukpa Kunley's insight starts to emerge into the world today. But I'm not sure that, I think I may have just interrupted you in the middle of describing how you experienced encountering these tales.
No, I think I've probably said enough.
No, it was such a great analogy you brought.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that also that these two realities are both constructed to some extent, and that the girl's fantasies are not to be dismissed as like, that's nothing.
Right.
So it's a reality that we all experience as children, and it's just as valid as the other reality we think is real.
Right, right, exactly. Right. But it's not like there's some ultra real, well, I guess from the Buddhist perspective, you could say there is a world of things as they are, but that is a world that is unmediated by all of the imaginal conceptual frames that we keep trying to lay over it, right? So the girl in the movie, just to go on with the analogy, the girl's regular life world, which is so awful and painful for her, is no more real than the imaginal world. And in fact, the imaginal world, where she can have some level of agency and some level of intention, in a certain sense, is even more real because it's more powerful in terms of transforming her. And I think that is actually true for all of us in our lives, that we have our regular, like as Kate was describing, we go through our days and we have this kind of, but we're living in a conceptually constructed situation for the most part. And then, from the Tantric Buddhist perspective, then you have these practices that you use the imagination to visualize these realms and these figures, spiritual archetypal figures that are reflecting the energies of enlightenment and wakefulness back at you to practice. What would it be like to be Tara, or to be Vajrayogini or one of these other archetypal tantric visualization figures. But so you get to play with the experience of that before you've actually, fully embodied it. But that's a training. That's a way of training in, letting go of particularly letting go of that whole, self-creating project, letting it collapse.
I think for me, and I wish I've already kind of tipped my hand a little bit, but encountering these stories also, I feel like I have to kind of swim through kind of a murky, messy set of experiences and emotions related to this theme before I can fully just be with the story itself. Like I feel like I've been singed by ways in which these concepts have been misused and misapplied in the West, in communities and teachers. And so I'm kind of having to there's really important emotional work. And I think you address this stuff well in the book, but there's a lot to kind of do just there,
Yeah. I know.
Alongside, on some level, also really appreciating the message of shaking people out of their sort of ordinary conceptual worldview, like we're talking about, and seeing something bigger and richer about what's actually real or the true nature of things. But it's like that relative absolutes. There's a battle there, I think, that brings up for me. So in that way, I think trying to work through the stories and make sense of them in the way that you kind of frame them and the life of Drukpa Kunley also allows more of an understanding of what is this thing, crazy wisdom, this Yompa idea, which then helps me kind of move forward in my thinking and feeling around that. That comes from somewhere, that comes from this particular historical period, that does or doesn't make sense in various ways, to my sensibility or what have you.
Oh, I think that's such an important point. It really is, because we're not encountering this concept of crazy wisdom without an enormous amount of baggage attached to it and direct experience for many of us, where we've encountered really the negative effects of that idea being abused. I can't think of any other way to say it, but, and, many of us have had, including myself, very personal experiences of that level of abuse. And that makes it very difficult to approach this topic with a kind of openness and willingness to see beyond the potential harm that these kinds of, because it does fly right in the face of how we like to imagine benefit being shared, benefit being offered, benefit being created in the world, because it seems to be doing the opposite. But I think, one of the things I often have told some of my students is that when you read about crazy wisdom or you read the story of somebody like Drukpa Kunley, one thing that can help is to try to bracket everything we think we know about that concept, and that, the stories that we know from, the last 50 years or so of abuses of those concepts. And then look to see what is right here. If this was all I had as a source for what is crazy wisdom, what would I learn right here? And then once that process has been done, then taking that and being able to kind of hold that in contrast to, or in relationship to, in some way, the ideas that we have already about these forms. And that can be quite surprising, because it does highlight that as you're saying, there is a history here. There is a context for this. There is a understanding of crazy wisdom that doesn't see the results of crazy actions as harmful because of their longer term benefit. Even if in the moment, the character in the folktale is outraged, which is often the case, there is this sense of outrage. Always, by the end of the story, the outraged person has begun to turn the vision of criticism and insight back onto themselves, and then sees the way that their own biases and their own, misunderstandings are coloring their understanding of what's actually happened. So I think that that's what I've had to do when I've worked on this material, because I'm certainly not here as a proponent of crazy wisdom and the kind of harm that I've seen unfold from that. Absolutely not. No. But it is a phenomena, a very powerful phenomena that is very suggestive, I think, for what's possible on the Buddhist path as a practitioner, in terms of the level of freedom that's possible. And I don't mean like, okay, we're going to feel so free we can just like do whatever the fuck we want. Excuse my language. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what I mean at all. I mean more the sense of just not being caught in the level of struggle that we are always engaged in, when we keep trying to assert a level of reality that isn't actually true, so that we get caught in grasping and clinging, or in pushing things away that we don't want. And there's this ongoing vacillation of struggle. So what would it be like to be without struggle? To just be free and at ease? Because one of the qualities of these yogis and yoginis is this notion of hula, in Tibetan hula, like a total relaxation, total ease and openness and fun and delight. There's a lot of delight in this energy of crazy wisdom.
Immediate presence, right?
Yeah, immediate freshness and
very sensory.
Yeah, a very, very vivid sensory involvement, so that really the sensory body is coterminous with the natural world. That there's a lack of barrier, a lack of duality there, a kind of just pure presencing.
The stories also remind me a bit, as I'm thinking about it, they have an impact like some of the Zen koans sort of do. Like they kind of create that sort of gap experience of like, but then in that space, there's something like alive that sort of happens.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I think I wonder if that is part of what they sometimes talk about as the shock value of these stories. That,
right.
This is like, your mind cannot grasp what you're hearing or reading or listening to. And, one of the things that was so instrumental for me in Bhutan was to interview Bhutanese, especially the older generation of Bhutanese who've been living in the world of Drukpa Kunley their whole lives. Mm-hmm. And just like, all you have to do is mention his name, and people are just smiling from ear to ear. They'll start telling you stories of him. Mm-hmm. Oh, and this rock was a transform of, his dog was transformed into this rock at this place, and this, just the bawdier the story, the more delighted they are. They're just having so much fun. And I finally asked this woman who is actually the granddaughter of the caretaker of the main temple in central Bhutan, where Drukpa Kunley was known to have spent a lot of time. I said, well, what's the point of like it being so kind of, bawdy and why? And she said, because then we remember. We remember the stories because they're so fun, and we love, we can laugh at ourselves. We can laugh at Drukpa Kunley. We can laugh in the experience of laughter. fun. There's a breaking down again of all of those just, ways that we tend to grasp and hold on. And you can even feel it, when you really laugh, like really, really hard, and it feels like your stomach is just going to like you're going to fall on the floor, but it just feels like everything's kind of breaking apart in your whole being. Mm-hmm. So there have been studies that have been done on the power of laughter to affect new and innovative states of being. Mm-hmm. So this woman that I was speaking to in Bhutan, she knew that instinctively, and she was putting that forward as why these tales are so powerfully influential in the minds and hearts of people in Bhutan today.
And yet they don't go around acting like him.
No.
Right?
Right, no. No. Right. It's almost like that's not even a question. It's not like people think, oh, well, I should do that. I should emulate that behavior. I should act like that. I don't know how that ended up unfolding in the ways we've seen it unfold in the West, but that's extremely unfortunate. More than unfortunate. It's downright harmful.
Yeah. Well, to bring a very modern Western idea to the table is this idea of kind of intent and impact, when you think about somebody's behavior. And I'm thinking about, like, it's actually useful to think in these stories that the intent is compassionate. The intent is to demonstrate the nature of reality. And also, as you've said, the impact needs to be that it actually worked, right? That the person, felt outraged, but then learned and grew, or like had some new wisdom arise or something.
Yeah.
So in that way, I think the intent and impact kind of both have to sort of come together in some way in these sorts of stories, maybe.
Well, I think that's true. And one of the things that it does definitely, I don't know that I'd really thought about it much until you've been describing, the way you both have been asking these questions, is that it really is the case that in all of these tales, the tale is never left hanging with with whoever Drukpa Kunley, of course, is always the protagonist, but with the other figures in the rest of the tale being left like, I don't understand. And I'm totally, I feel totally, hurt by this. And it's never left like that. I mean, it's always left with some kind of recognition that, the other figures in the tale have to seeing what's really going on and not what seems to be going on. I think there's a lot of this theme of the seeming level of reality, which is where we tend to live. And then what is actually going on and the connecting to that more and more.
It's also making me think about the way that our reactions to behaviors change over time, or that are, in some way it's up to us and our own minds to figure out how we want to, or how we're going to react to somebody else's behavior. Like, are we going to be outraged and hurt and miserable? Or are we going to kind of bring this onto our path and somehow grow from it or learn?
That's a really great point. Absolutely. I think a lot of crazy wisdom and, the crazy wisdom yogis and yoginis, it's very much the yogic child of the tantric tradition. These yogic practices that are working to transform, that are using the body also, very much using the body as a locus for transformation. And so a lot of, it's not just talking, it's a lot of embodied actions and not hiding from the body as a sexual object, as a sensory object, as the main mechanism through which we are in contact with a seeming outer reality. Even though, from the ultimate perspective in Tantra, there is no outer and inner, there's no such distinction exists. It's a fabrication.
So Liz, if people have enjoyed this conversation and, want to hear more from you, study with you, what can they do? Where can they go to be in touch?
Well, I could say certainly if anyone is specifically interested in the topic of crazy wisdom and wants to know more, I'm teaching a retreat. It's a long weekend retreat in March on crazy wisdom. And that information about that retreat and about a lot of the other teaching that I'm doing can be found on the Natural Dharma Fellowship website. It's just Natural Dharma Fellowship, or I think it's just www.naturaldharma.org. And then there's a schedule link, and that showcases all of the different retreats that we're going to be offering in 2022, and of course for the rest of this year. So that's one definite way to get in touch with me, and to hopefully I can then meet all of you, whoever's listening. I guess that's probably the main source of contacting me, is through the website, and my email address is there. I also teach in different other Buddhist centers, the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies. I'm teaching a year-long program there and writing spiritual autobiography. And I love teaching down for BCBS, because they have kind of an interesting dual focus that incorporates a little bit more academic and scholastic emphasis than we do it at Wonderwell. Wonderwell Mountain Refuge is our retreat center in northern New Hampshire. And again, the schedule page on the Natural Dharma Fellowship website will show the retreats that we're offering in person and the hybrid retreats that we offer. We're doing hybrid retreats now that are both online and on-site. We're doing just on-site retreats, and we're doing just online retreats. So we're trying to cover all the bases. Exactly. Yeah. And I would be delighted to meet anybody who is interested in reaching out.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. This was a lovely conversation.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Wonderful to talk with both of you. And thank you for your insightful and helpful questions.
Fascinating stuff. Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.